Well, today we have a very interesting topic about culture, actually entitled Culture and Common Human Values. I think it doesn't go by a day in which some issue about cultural diversity comes up. In fact, today there was an announcement of the Nobel Prize in Literature that went to a Turkish writer, Orhan Pamuk, who has written several books about the clash of cultures in his society between Western society and Islamic society. And also today, in France, a lower parliament passed a bill, not a law, but a bill, making it a crime if someone publicly denies the fact that the killing of Armenians during the, early 20th century, 1910, 1913, if they denied that that action was an act of genocide. So we're always having these issues in the world about cultural diversity. And I invited Xiaorong Li, who's a research scholar at the Institute of Philosophy and Public Policy at College Park, to come today and tell us how we could solve this problem of cultural diversity. And she's written a book called Ethics, Human Rights and Culture, and I think a lot of the stuff you'll talk today will be coming from that book. So without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Xiaorong Li.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Silverman. I like the title of the series, Medical Humanities Hour. But maybe in my case should be switched to Humanities Hour for the medical profession. The reason is because I don't really have any background training in medical or public health, and really so it's going to be bringing you out of your perspectives to go to the humanities, how the philosophers tackle those questions. But I promised Professor Silverman that I'll use examples that are directly or indirectly relevant to medical practices and public health practices, if I can succeed. As Professor Silverman just said, there is not a day passing in today's world without us coming face to face to questions of cultural diversity, globalization. Well, in fact, I think globalization forces us to confront, brings us to look at different cultural practices and forces us to make decisions in very complex situations involving not only cultural but other diverse factors. And also, we must act. There are certain situations you can't stand there thinking philosophically. All the values, judgments relevant to the cultures of the people involved in the situation. What do we know? Who is to decide? What's the common standards? Do we have any common standards? No, we don't. And who is, going to tell us which standards should be accepted as the common standards? These are the kind of questions I want to talk about today. There, of course, the fact that you're here, I think you probably have thought about those questions. And if I had the time to go around the room, most of you probably have answers to them. That makes the talk a little bit easy because you have thoughts about them, and you may have questions or solutions for us. The fact philosophers don't do their work by giving answers. And rather like the ancient, Greek philosopher Socrates said, philosophers make people think by asking questions. If I could ask a few questions to make you think those questions harder and find that they are actually more complex and difficult than you originally thought in addressing them, and that will be a success for my talk. The fact that you probably have answers to them, you've thought about it to make the talk easier, but also makes it harder, because how can I ask good questions to make you think harder and to make you find this talk useful? That might be, because you already, have ideas, and either I have to convince you your ideas need to be, readjusted, or maybe even you've been thinking in a rather partial way about those questions. But anyway, that's a challenge to me. I promised I will use examples from the medical practices and public health. So I'll start with some extreme examples. I think extreme examples are always good for teaching purposes, because then you think about the extreme pictures, then in actual life you confront things that are not so extreme. So in a way you can bring bringing, what's an English expression? I've been living in Paris for 2 years, so I'm forgetting my English. So you can bring out the extreme cases, what you have thought about and learned in those cases, and it will be easier for you to apply. The extreme cases, I'm sure some of you have known about them. The first one is female genital cutting, also known as female circumcision. This has become a problem not just in some Muslim countries or in Africa, but it's a problem here. We confront. For example, a couple of years ago in Boston, there's a clinic set up for women from immigrants from Somalia and some other countries to go to talk to doctors about their problems. And then the doctors were shocked to discover this surgery, what sort of torturous process and what they did to women to create this tremendous pain for the rest of their lives. So how to deal with it? It's a cultural practice. How doctors should get in to judge the situation. Could you go tell them, don't do this to your daughters anymore? What do you do? But it is a health hazard. It's tremendously difficult to help those women not to experience such extreme pain. So here's one example. And the other one I want to talk about is from my own home country, China, family planning. Ever since the government started the family planning policy, which require couples in cities to have only one child, and then in rural and remote areas they may have exceptions. But the fact is that most Chinese people prefer a boy rather than a girl, and this was at least still widely practiced or as a belief 20 years ago, and there has been change. I was going to talk about that. So there have been problems with the imbalance of gender. So now you look at the statistics today in China. You have the normal ratio of boys and girls is like 105 boys per 100 girls, right? So, but in China, some provinces you get 149 boys per 100 girls. So there's this huge problem, and also it has to do with the availability of getting ultrasound during pregnancy. So women would go, and because of the technology, it's so easily available. You just pay a fee, even though it is illegal. But you can just go to some back room, you pay a fee, and you check out the sex of the fetus. And so there's a huge number of abortion when people discover they weren't pregnant with a boy. And so there's huge problems. This is also a public health problem. It's a medical practice problem. But again, it's a cultural preference for boys. At least that was the belief most people have, that it is better for them to have a boy. The third example I want to use is from some tribal communities in Eskimo, where there's this ice floating practice. When older parents got really old and couldn't work and also got sick, they send them to the wilderness. Just send them out there to die, instead of taking care of them until their natural death. And this practice was, I'm not sure it's still today, but at least half a century ago, as far as I read, it was still practiced. So it's this old age care problem. So how do you deal with it in a modern society? I'm sure globalization has brought modern economic activities and the forms of healthcare to that part of the world. So those are some of the examples just to get you started, that even though every day we hear about Nobel Prize and French Parliament decisions about this and that, but right here in your medical rooms, you will confront, or you have already confronted those things that have to do with traditional practices. And as a doctor, and the fact that you enter this profession, you accept certain very fundamental human values. One of them is health, which for you, you're deeply committed to promote that health, that value. And so how is this value, we think, as a universal common human value, deal with those cultural practices which, from the doctor's point of view, is doing harm to the body, is to create medical problems, disease, or is not to taking care of children or the elderly. So those are some examples. There are more, I'm sure, if I go around the room, and you can give me more examples, but since we don't have time, so we'll move on, but I'll make sure we'll save time for you to talk. How to deal with those questions, since they're very complex, and it would take me many hours or days to talk about all of those questions. I want to do today, in our very limited time, one thing, or one thing will lead to another. But we'll start with the question, what is culture? Because what philosophers does, as I said, is not to give you the ready-made answers, because I don't have them. And what I can do is to get along with you to think about how do we deal with those questions. And one place we can start is to ask the question, what is culture? I think you all have answers to that. In fact, maybe I will take a couple of questions. Does anybody have ideas? What is culture?
A group that shares common beliefs, rituals, and behaviors.
Okay. So culture is lodged on a group or a community, and you used a very important word, share. Okay. Any other contending definitions of culture? You don't want to talk, okay. But I'm sure you have ideas. Maybe that will bring those ideas out. So one way to think about what is culture is to think what is not culture, or what looks like culture, but if we think more carefully, it turns out either resembles culture or overlaps with culture, or actually is different from culture. So you can use this mental image of different areas. What do we call them? We label them. So you may, I think one useful way to do this is to think about religion. Is religion part of culture, bigger than culture, or completely irrelevant to culture? Because religion is a shared belief by a community of people.
But cult and culture go together all the time.
Culture and cult.
The religious beliefs of a community impact culture, culture impacts the cult.
So they're related. But in some ways you can think of a religious belief is a subset of the beliefs. So it's more worship. You don't, when you have a core belief, you don't question in some ways. Like.
And I would argue that religion that's not a form of spirituality would be more in alignment with culture, or can be, than some people practice religion and they don't necessarily do it for spiritual reasons, a communion with a higher being, but just for the rituals itself.
Right.
So in that case, it's more of an overlap.
Yeah. So it's either an overlap, or you can arguably culture might be a broader. Or if you draw a bigger circle, then religion is a smaller circle inside. Or maybe, arguably, it's an overlapping relationship. For example, if it becomes organized religion, and then it's institutionalized, has a hierarchy of authority and power, and then when religion and state become the same thing, then maybe that's out of culture. So because we have this sense of culture being rather informal, not mandated, that brings us to another distinction: law, regulations, policies, those codified that set of ideas or regulations. And I think the distinction there is more clear. But sometimes people too, like you talk about legal culture. I mean, legal culture cannot be without the law, right? In a sense. I mean, so law is not exactly outside culture. And particular people who argue that, like when we talk about human rights, they say, but that is Western cultural idea. But human rights now are human rights laws. It's institutionalized at the United Nations, and in our American Constitution we have human rights, Bill of Rights. So in a way, law overlaps with culture in some sense, but then it's not exactly a culture. Like you say somebody violated a law, you don't say you violated a cultural convention. So there's something interesting there. I think maybe again it's a kind of overlapping relationship. Another interesting set of ideas to bring in is science. When we talk about science, we talk about a kind of knowledge that's formal, and knowledge that can be reduced to precise statements, can be tested. You have the apple, you say, I dropped the apple, will the apple go up or down? And I may have a strong cultural belief that apple will go up, but I'll be wrong if I'm talking about science, because the apple only goes down. And I can explain by gravity and all the physics stuff I can bring in. So, but then again, some philosophers of science argue sometimes there are competing theories about the Earth, the universe, and by the end analysis, it's a belief. There are certain scientific fundamental things that has not been tested, but we trust them. And we use them. So there is some blurred boundary somewhere. But again, I think in this case, science and culture, the distinction is more clear than in other cases. This brings me, I should move a little faster. So I think a broader concept of culture that can be inclusive of some of the examples we use, and to allow us to have the flexibility to consider the relationship between culture and religion, culture and the law, culture and science, is a very broad concept. I don't know whether you're going to agree with this, but for the convenience of our talk today, or for the purpose of my writing that book, I decided I will stay with a very broader concept, which is a very short one. It says culture is a body of informal knowledge. So one way to think about this is if we say American culture or French culture, and when I step off the plane from Paris, I enter this familiarity, this warmth that I know almost everything what's going on here in this country. Not the fact, not in France, because the language barrier, the fact I wasn't there for too long. And this familiarity, who told me? I never went to school to learn ABC, everything about American life. I learned informally. And in some sense, the convention, the way people smile, the way people grade you, all these things you can consider broadly as the concept of American culture, because it is this general, broad body of informal knowledge to contrast it to science and or law. Because the informal, I didn't learn from school, I didn't test everything, I didn't go to the lab to do experiments on them in order to accept them. But it's different from religion, because it's not strictly something spelled out in the Bible. It's something so informal. I learned by informal channels of my experiences living in this society. But anyway, this can be contested, of course. But the advantage of accept this concept is to be able to have a very broad concept, and we can move on to spell out the details. And so the second way to approach the question, what is culture? I'm just moving a little faster. Since we don't have a precise definition, is to ask, how does culture behave? When we refer to something in everyday life conversation, culture diversity, pluralism of culture, and this thing we refer to, how does it behave? What kind of characteristics it has? How do we describe it? If I want to tell you, suppose you're from Mars, right? I tell you there's something called culture on Earth. How do I describe to you what it looks like? And this is the way that most cultural anthropologists and sociologists have adopted when they try to describe to us, to the rest of this human society, what a culture is in a scholarly way. That's how they approach, they characterize culture rather than giving you a very precise definition. And so very quickly, among anthropologists and sociologists, they're roughly divided into a few camps. But since we're here using extreme examples, I just want to take the two extreme views among this circle of academics. The two extreme views of describing what culture, how does it behave, and what characteristics does culture have, are the two extremes. One I call classical school of thinking, the other I call contemporary school of thinking. So the classical schools were the most active after the colonial era, and when anthropologists started to going into different places outside our own society to discover all these amazingly different ways of life. They come back, they describe to us what these cultures are, then they generalize a broad theory about what culture is. So the classical school of thinking describe culture as a very mysterious thing. It's as if it has its own mind. It's sealed. It's a strictly defined community. They all share. They have a uniqueness, and most importantly, cannot be comprehended or penetrated by outsiders. Can only be. You can go in, you can practice, you can sit there, you do the same thing, but you don't really understand. And so it has uniqueness. and has unity, which means it's all shared by all the people in that community with sealed borders. And lastly, it doesn't seem to change over time, has this timelessness to it. So this is why I'm using very, if there's any anthropologists here, I would be challenged, but I'm giving you a stark picture. And then the contemporary school, as you can imagine, is the opposite of the classical school. The contemporary school, why it's named as such, because they are anthropologists today who are working in this profession. They come back now, well, they don't have to come back because it's globalization. They can send us emails, they can, call on the phone, and then they say, cultures everywhere are being penetrated. The borders are porous, are open. You can understand everything, and everything you look at, there's familiarity, and things are changing fast. Even in this remote jungle, on this side of the earth, we see cell phone. People using cell phone. People have ideas about they should go out to stage a protest if oil companies are coming in, chopping down their Amazon forests, and so there are familiar practices, ideas, even in such strange places. So the contemporary schools, as you can tell by now, they describe culture as having such characteristics as internally diverse. So it's not complete unity, and it's not just uniqueness, but also similarity to our own, and also the borders open and evolves and changes over time. And so I put together this to summarize what I would call, if we're still trying to learn from the anthropologists and sociologists what culture is, this is what we learned. You get a picture, what I call paradoxical characteristics of culture. You have anthropologists who tell you completely the opposite views, but if you want to reach some kind of consensus view from the professions that study culture for living, this is the view you get. And again, in order to move ahead, to have some grasp of what culture is, I think a consensus can be built by accepting that culture itself is paradoxical. So you can think about this, taking any culture, we say American culture, it's diverse. We're sitting here, we have Christianity in this country, we have Islamic practices, we have Buddhists, we have Confucians, we have all kinds of religion, we have all kinds of cultural practices, beliefs in medicine, and now you have alternative medicine coming from places like China, India, practiced in this country, acupuncture, Chinese herb medicine. So American culture doesn't refer to one set of unique practices or beliefs, rather internally, sometimes clashing set of beliefs and ideas and practices. And it's changing. Think about American culture 100 years ago and today. I don't have to go into it. None of us has lived for 100 years, but we can easily answer that question. And our border is completely open, of course. Immigrants bringing in, crossing the border, not only goods, but ways of production, but also ideas. And we go out, we go into other places, we bring the same thing, we cross. Let's call it globalization. It's the border crossing of manufactured goods, technology, human beings, and ideas and practices. And we can, of course, it's harder to talk about the more traditional societies as having those paradoxical characteristics, but if you want to, we can do it, and it's not difficult. And I have tried to do that to Chinese culture, for example, and we can talk about French culture, and we can talk about Indian culture. We can talk about, or you take a smaller culture, let's say, Native American culture or African American culture. We can take anything you want to call a culture. We can identify paradoxical characteristics. So the two ways to approach the concept of culture, and which need to some sort of a working concept, what I call what culture is. And the first one is the shorter one that says simply it's a body of informal knowledge. By living in that society, by studying that society, by having experiences, we learn in different ways. The informal, sometimes not written, not spoken even, knowledge about things, and then we feel familiar, and we are part of that culture. And so that's the short answer. But the longer answer, I don't have time to go into it. I think it spells out how the culture behaves, what you call that body of informal knowledge. It has been historically inherited, but transformed. It's not, fixed in time, and also it's embodied and constantly contested in tradition. But it's not just one tradition. That sometimes, in any given society, there are competing traditions, and it's incorporated in our practices in every day. Like, for example, I stand here, I just spit. And what would you think? This is very uncultural, right? But not in other places. The thing is, the culture is not ideas I tell you, not printed, not necessarily in regulations. Sometimes it's your, it's incorporated in the way we behave. And it's transmitted, as I already said, through informal channels. We don't necessarily go to universities to learn them, but we do learn, but not everything we learn in classrooms about culture. So I call that as a social learning. You learn through living in a society, socializing with the groups, with the people, in a community. The community is in some ways a fixed community. It could be a nation, a country, a church, and it could be a university, and it could be a profession. And any community, it's in that community, that set of informal knowledge is lodged, it's transmitted, is recognized and carried on. But again, that community may have very porous borders. Like, you can be a woman, a feminist, a doctor, and you went to universities, and you can be Christian or Buddhist, you can be from a Jewish family. So that multiplicity of your identity makes it possible for this community you belong to at the medical school to be open-bordered, because you don't just belong to the medical community, you belong to other communities too. So the communities overlap. What happens when they overlap? They open to each other, and you are the agent. You go across those borders all the time, and that makes all the communities open, and the borders are porous. You go in and out with your ideas, with your practices, with your values, and you can easily communicate with each community. Sometimes not so easy, but you manage to do it, and it's possible to do. So any questions so far? I don't mean to hand you this definition you take away and you apply, but just to make you think whether this is somewhere we can start as a starting point, since most of you don't want to tell me what do you think culture is. I wonder whether this is somewhere in the ballpark of what you've been thinking, or is it useful to, for you to go on and with this fundamental, set of challenging ideas of what culture is. Okay, so this view about culture, I can go into some details to talk about the academic history and who are the people who actually have written books to support those approaches to culture, and it's very interesting, but we don't have time. So I want to go straight to some of the key questions. You're here, you want to ask that question, which is, what about cultural relativism, which is a direct challenge to the idea of common human values. If there are common human values, how do you deal with different cultures? Don't we respect them? Don't we respect diverse cultural views about the same questions? For example, you say, health is a fundamental value, and we believe it's a common human value. But then there might be some cultural beliefs that believe, for example, the examples I give, from our perspective, those are anti that fundamental value because it's doing injury, harm to the body. It's not compatible with the value of health. So how do you deal with that? To tell people they must not do that? They say, well, that's what we consider as make the human being dignified, to give us pride, and it's a very essential part of our understanding of ourselves, of our society, what we're all about. And how can you tell us it's invalid, it's anti-human value and should be abandoned? So, cultural relativism, if we had time to go into it, there are many different kinds of cultural relativism. Basically, I'll tell you two. One is called descriptive, describing relativity in cultural practices. The other is called normative. The idea of a normative is to prescribe, is to say you ought to do this, you must do that, you should do things in certain ways. So the difference between the two types, descriptive is say, well, if you look around the world, you can say people everywhere have their own values and beliefs. What do you think as being bad and wrong, they think as being good and correct. So relativity is a fact of life. But think again, since it's descriptive, that means it's true about reality, but has the truth been tested? And the short is no, it hasn't, because nobody has even the anthropologists haven't gone around the world to document every cultural practice and then draw the conclusion. Empirically, it is true. Every culture's value is relative to their own beliefs and their own moral standards, and they're not comparable to each other. Nobody actually has done that. And there's a very good book by somebody. It's published by Harvard University Press, does exactly that, to question whether this description, this so-called empirical conclusion, has ever been tested by the empirical scientists, social scientists like anthropologists and sociologists. No, they haven't done that. They've done to different cultures, but not all. If as you study empirical, you have to study them all in order to draw a conclusion, right? Otherwise, it's just a hypothesis. If anybody is not clear about that, I can go into it. But what I'm interested from the philosopher's point of view is the second kind, the normative cultural relativism, which doesn't make statements about what is actually true or not true in the world about cultural relativity, but rather prescribe this principle to us by saying you must use moral standards from somebody's own culture to justify or to judge that person's views and practices. So I have written and try to be precise a description. So it's not to say people do make moral judgments in a cultural relativistic way, but rather say you must use relativist methods to judge people. Or actually, you should never judge people in other cultures with your own standards. You have to judge anybody's behavior and views according to that person's own cultural standards only. So it's to issue some kind of principle, is to issue some kind of prohibition, never judge other people in other cultures by your own moral standards, or do this, only judge people, so it's prescriptive and or normative, and this is the kind I'm interested in talking about, because it's harder to reject. As you can see, the descriptive cultural relativism is easier, because you can just find one example of culture where there is no cultural relativity, or the thesis of relativity doesn't exist or doesn't hold in that culture. Then you reject the general thesis that cultures are all relative, or moral standards are all culturally relative. But this is harder to reject. It's because it's not an empirical statement. Like you say, I believe the sun comes out every day from the east in the morning, and there's one day the sun comes out from the west. So that empirical statement is rejected, right? But now I don't say that. I say something different. I say that, we must believe the sun comes out from the east every morning. And then how do you reject that? It's not empirically, doable. So how do you do that? But philosophers have written, volumes of books and talk incessantly about how to do it. We can, go into a whole list of theories and ways of doing it. But since our time is very limited, I just want to maybe try one idea on you. Is to use our concept of culture. And if we accept the concept we have as a working concept to guide us through our thinking, and here we can apply that concept and to ask the question, if culture is like that, it's paradoxical body of informal language, evolves over time, it's internally diverse. That means the moral judgments inside any given culture can be diverse. Like when you say, female cutting, is it right or wrong? If you take any culture, even in Somali, in Nigeria, you find a community called, Muslim community, where in most cases that is practiced. There is internal objection to that practice. So what I'm saying is, if culture is like that, is it possible? Is it plausible to uphold normative cultural relativism? So, as a philosopher, I don't have the answer. I just ask you a question. Because normative cultural relativism, if you read this carefully, there are a few keywords there. Only, you consider, the judgments and standards must be considered valid or invalid only relative to the moral agent's own culture. His or her moral views and actions ought to be considered right if they are judged right according to the standards in his or her own culture. So you have a moral agent. That moral agent may belong to a few smaller subcultural communities. Which one is her or his own? And those communities overlap, and they may have clashing moral standards. Which ones should we use? We say use only his or her own moral judgments in her own cultural community. But that community is changing, and it's internally diverse, and has clashing judgments or moral standards about a particular practice that this moral agent is making a judgment about. Which ones do we use? is it possible to see what is my culture's own standards? Own means it's not shared by any other cultures. Is that still possible in the globalization world today? We can take a million of examples. For example, abortion in this country. Do we have one standard in this country to judge abortion? No. Any standards we take, is that uniquely American or Western? No. And had those standards changed over time? Yes. Which one we use? We refer to American in 1970, 1990, 2006. And since are continuously changing, and the communities that support one position or another keep shifting. This is very interesting. But we can't go into the details. So how I'm doing in terms of time?
I think you could. I think you have one or two more slides.
Yeah. I think those are some of the ideas, suggestions for you to use. You can work out the answer to that question. Is it possible to uphold normative cultural relativism as a sound position? So you can go, use the working concept of culture and ask questions along those lines. It's just an outline of a few points, but certainly can be spelled out. This is the indeterminacy of what is one's own cultural standard. And there's question of the transformation. And there's question of the diverse clashing and standards in my own cultural community. And this has tremendous practical consequences. And one example I want to use is honor killing in some communities. One recent example was 2002. I think there was a case in Pakistan in some rural area where a woman was openly raped in front of a group of religious elders because she had an affair with a man without the permission from her family. What is the cultural standard for judging that practice as a punishment for the woman? And the punishment was prescribed by the religious leader in that local community. When you look at Pakistan as a society, as a culture, or the local rural area, or the local rural Muslim community as a community, any layer, any bigger or smaller circle you choose, there are clashing standards. The women's activists who are from the local rural area who stood up for the woman, and some family members reported to the police, and the law enforcement came, and the government, eventually Parliament, got involved. And there are some members of the parliaments who supported punishment for whoever who issued that order who committed that crime. And then at the same time, of course, you have mobilization of others who said, this is a cultural practice, it's a tradition, and you have to respect the autonomy of the community, and you have to respect their own values. So you see, not only that, then the international community got involved. I think Human Rights Watch, which is a human rights group based in New York, issued a statement. And then other international women's groups also got involved in this case. But they are on the same side as the local feminist groups, women's activists. So you can't say they're just outsiders. They're on the same side. They're just out there supporting some local groups. So it's a good example to think about. It's impossible to apply the normative cultural relativism as a principle to guide your action. If I'm this outsider, I look at this case in Pakistan, what do? I say I use only local standards, but there are clashing several. Which one should I use? Okay, I decide not to use because, as a good relativist, I said I can't do anything because there's no one ready-made, single, unique, unified standard that is local for me to use to judge their behavior. Then I don't act. But what's the consequences of not acting? Or think about the practice of female genital cutting. Don't act means many girls as young as 10 years old are being forced into that practice and then bear the pain, the tremendous pain for the rest of their lives. Can a 10-year-old make autonomous, informed decision about such things? So I don't act. I say I'm a good relativist because I can't decide, because I don't have a local standards there for me to use. Then I am committing from my own, suppose there is one cultural perspective, I am doing an immoral act by not acting. So there are many problems with trying to stick to the principle of normative cultural relativism. The very last thing I'm going to just jump ahead is what do you do? So when you, for example, when you're standing here saying certain common human values like basic human rights are universal, and then you confront a practice that seems to challenge that belief, and it's coming from a culture or a cultural community. We at those talks or when you write an article, you always want to come out with some simple walk-away rule of thumb. This is that sort of thing. So what do? There are three. Well, there might be more, but this is how far I got. I think there are at least the three things you can do. First is to try to identify the moral equivalence of any choices you're going to make. Like the example I just gave you, by saying I don't have any determinant answer in this moral situation of judging whether female cutting is good or bad or honor killing is good or bad. I'm not going to take any position, but the moral consequences of not taking position is a moral decision. So you have to identify what would be the equivalent of your position, whatever you take, and then spell that out, and then see whether it's acceptable to you. The second is to uncover core functions. Sometimes the diversities we see, how you have Chinese medicine, Western medicine, you have different ways of treating women. Sometimes those diversities are surface diversities. They do not necessarily challenge or undermine a core value. I spelled out some of these examples. For example, some people argue that by practice female circumcision, you provide the girl a more secure future. Because in certain societies, women are not allowed to work. Women have no independent ways of making a living other than being married to somebody who can make a living for them. And so you have a family, you're secure, your economic future is provided. Suppose that was the case. Suppose. But of course it's not the case in almost any places now on earth. But suppose that was the case. That was the thinking underneath this practice. So we can understand it. We don't just go out there to say you're barbaric, you're backward, you're just stupid. We don't say that. We say we understand. And suppose that were the case, this was the way. And there's reason to think this was a good way to provide for women's future. But the very idea of a secure women's future is consistent with our belief about human security, basic human living standards. That is one human right, right? The right to basic living. So there's no contradiction there. But the problem is that practice may no longer serve the purpose. For example, women now can. We know, like in our own society, we know women can go out to make a living for themselves. They do not have to depend on their husbands. And if it can be done here, in some ways it can be done there. And the globalization fact is that it's been done in so many places now. So it's a start of a conversation by saying, at the core value level, we do not disagree. We actually disagree. But on the surface, we still think about certain practices that are being performed as being good at performing certain functions to actualize the basic value. But that practice doesn't anymore look at what's happening today. So we can start this conversation, then maybe hopefully people who insist on practicing that will be convinced and they see the point and give up on the practice. And the third one is to rule out corrupt judgments. There are many ways to do that. There are a few things that make our judgments corrupt, what I call. First is faulty information. For example, my favorite example is there used to be a Chinese medical practice belief, which is, when you go to the field, you harvest a pumpkin, and the pumpkin can rot in the field, but it won't come off this, what do you call that? So the doctors prescribe that dried up stem as a medicine for women to take if they want to keep their baby, if they don't want to have a miscarriage. But that's faulty information. We all know that. If I want to keep my baby, would I take that medicine and feel good about it and I'm secure, I'm not going to have a miscarriage? No, I'm not going to accept that. I'm going to do something else. So faulty information can corrupt our judgment. We can rule out that judgment that, for example, the judgment could be something like, it is good for women to take that stand and then feel secure about their baby. And then there are many things that can corrupt our judgment. The other thing is, for example, somebody who's never been in the right mind to make good judgments, can't tell right from left, night from day, and always, not recognize family members from strangers and walk into traffic without looking both ways. So has a track record of not in the right frame of mind to make good judgments. Then a judgment coming out of such a person, we may be very suspicious. We have to do something else to test that judgment. We can't take it for granted. So we can rule it out in a sense. And there are many things like emotionally, like moral sentiments have never properly, cultivated in a person. And a person who has always been deprived of proper moral education, for example, not properly socialized and growing up as a lonely person and locked up, whatever circumstances deprive the person of the appropriate kind of moral sentiments. So this person, for example, doesn't feel motivated when watching an innocent child being killed, has no feeling about it. Then if a moral judgment come out of such a person, we can, on the basis of that, we have to test it. We can't take that judgment for granted. So when we confront those judgments we consider are possibly corrupted, we don't take them seriously. We don't say that's a challenge to universal common values. We say those judgments themselves are suspicious, need to be tested before we can take it seriously as a challenge to human values, common human values. I think that's the last thing I want to say. But Do we have time for question?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I want to thank you for a wonderful